I love your point about like when you ask people, do you answer the phones? They're like, yeah, we never miss a call. And it's just like, it's not true. Or how's your team at converting on the phone? Oh, they're amazing. And it's like, yeah, except for they're at 50% conversion. There's so many things that are broken. So you got to get that under control to be able to get full arch added on top of it.
So when you're inundated with the day in and day out of patients rolling through the door and rolling out the doors just as quickly, you don't start to realize until you want to add something like full arch to your business where those processes are broken. Besides systems and processes, having your team emotionally prepared, I think, is probably the most important part of developing full arch. We have patients that are looking for care that have been in this situation for years.
Welcome back to another episode of the Full Arch Advantage podcast. I'm your host, Gary Bird. I'm the founder of SMC National, where we help you create, convert, and close more full arch cases so you can grow the way that you want. But you can't grow if you're trying to add full arch on top of broken GP operations. Today, I have a special guest, Kristen, who's our manager of our coaching department at SMC, and she's going to break down the 3-tier approach that you have to have in place in your GP practice before you should ever consider marketing for full arch. Stay tuned. We are live, and I'm excited to have this conversation with Kristen today, who is a team member with us at SMC National. She heads up our coaching department. And before we jump into this, Kristen, first, could you just tell our audience a little bit about your in-office experience? I know you've worked in dental offices before. Could you tell just the audience a little bit about that?
Yeah, absolutely. So super excited to talk about this topic today, but my experience comes from a little over 10 years experience working inside of dental practices, from GP to specialty, specialty being perio, peds. I've worked in single practice locations. I've worked in DSOs. And so a lot of my background actually comes from the business side of dental. So optimizing practice processes to really drive many different, initiatives in the practice. So whether it's revenue, it's creating systems or processes for training our teams, it's fostering relationships with patients in our teams. So a lot of really everything on the business side.
That's awesome. Yeah. So you've probably seen people do things the right way, and you've seen people do things the wrong way. And I'm excited to have this conversation around how to know when you're ready for full arch. So often what we've seen, and I know you've seen this countless times, I have as well, is like a doctor will go out and take a course and say, we're ready for full arch. And they're really not. They're actually miles away from being ready, and their team's not ready. And there's a lot of different things that they're just not ready for, but they don't know that. They don't, and I think that where that comes from is that most of the time for GP offices, when in the past, when they wanted to add a new skill, you've probably noticed this before, but this podcast is unsponsored. What that means is we don't get paid to do it, but we want to bring you the best information possible. So how do we make sure that this content stays on the air? We need you to like and subscribe. Wherever you're at, whatever you're listening on, just give us a thumbs up or subscribe. And that helps us out so much. I know that you probably haven't done it, so I'm just going to sit here and wait until you do. 95% of our listeners have not subscribed to our podcast. So go ahead and do it now. Don't make this awkward. All right, good. Back to the show. They went out and learned it. They brought it back to the office, and it was simple processes changes. And the team, maybe at first it was a little rocky, but the team kind of figures it out and everything ends up working well. With full arch, it's just nothing could be further from the truth. And so there's going to be 3 things that we're going to look at today to know if you're ready to add full arch. Number 1, you got to add systems. You got to have the right systems. And we're going to talk about that. Number 2, you have to have your team emotionally ready. And the doctor has to be emotionally ready too. And we're going to talk about what that means exactly. And then 3, you got to have the right people. And it's not just about having the right doctor. There's several other people in your office that has to be ready for this, and you can't wing it. So let's start with the system ones first. How does someone know if, let's pretend there's somebody here, they have multiple offices and they want to add full arch. They've already taken the course. They've already placed some implants, so they feel good about that. They got a mentor. How do they know if their systems are ready to add full arch at those practices?
Yeah, so what I typically find is that most practices fail when they try to add broken systems on top of broken systems. So we have to remember that full arch is very complex, right? It's not your bread and butter dentistry. And so when we talk about systems in full arch, one of the biggest things that practices have to have in place before they even think about talking full arch to patients is viable financing options. And they have to have many of them. A lot of practices have one or two third-party lenders, but are they the right lenders that will help all credit ranges or financial backgrounds for patients? So we have to remember that with financing, we're not just looking at, a couple of $1,000s, right? We're looking at tens of thousands of dollars for this type of treatment. And so we have to make sure that practices have viable financing options that are not only affordable to their patients, but also, like I said, can represent all lines of credit. The other thing too, that as far as systems go, we have to make sure that we're answering the phone, right? We have to make sure that if we're putting money into marketing, we're getting those leads to come through. We have to make sure that we're available for those leads as well. And so that is another area that we see a lot of practices struggle, and they just don't get it right in the beginning, is financing and making sure that we are available right at the front for those leads to come through.
Yeah, that's a really good point. So what I hear you saying is if you're not super confident that your GP processes or systems are airtight, then adding full arch on top of it is going to fail. It's going to cause everything to fail, where your GP is going to struggle and your full arch. Now, the reason that GP, you can get away with broken systems, and I would love your thoughts on this, Kristen. And this is from the outside looking in from my perspective. A lot of times you feel like you can get away with broken systems, or it doesn't feel like broken systems because GP, you're kind of like, you stay busy all the time, right? So there's always that next patient that's coming in. Even if you're not doing a good job with the recall, even if you're not doing a good job answering the phones, even if you're not scheduling people properly and having your schedule all set up properly, you still are like on to the next patient. It's kind of, it feels endless because everybody's been trained to come in every 6 months, but full arch just isn't that way.
Yeah. So that's a really great point. So when you're busy and inundated with the day in and day out of patients rolling through the door and rolling out the door just as quickly, you don't start to realize until you want to add something like full arch to your business where those processes are broken. If you were to go into a practice and say, how often do you answer the phone? They'd say every day, right? Or maybe they might miss a couple of calls, but until you start actually identifying by tracking data, you'll be really surprised at the systems that are broken that you don't even realize are broken. One of the biggest ones is actually the patient journey. And we could talk about that all day long. We could talk about, having an exceptional patient journey and an exceptional patient experience, which is super important in full arch. But a lot of practices don't even realize that is one of the biggest parts that's broken inside of a GP practice, because it's almost like an assembly line, essentially, right? We get them through the door.
Yeah.
We pump them into treatment. We train them to come back every 6 months, and it's a rolling cycle. But when you start to add something more complex is where you're going to realize that actually maybe some of my processes and systems are broken in GP, and it can cause a lot of uproar, but the reward is so much greater. So
yeah, that's so true. I love your point about like when you ask people, do you answer the phones? They're like, yeah, we never miss a call. And it's just like, it's not true. Or how's your team at converting on the phone? Oh, they're amazing. And it's like, yeah, except for they're at 50% conversion.
Yep.
Like I hear this all the time. Or do you have availability? Oh yeah, we have a ton of availability. And then I go on their schedule and look at it with them. And I know you've done this before too. And it's like, yeah, you have 1 hygiene appointment this week, 2 next week, and then 10 the following week. And it's like, patients don't like, there's so many things that are broken. So you got to get that under control to be able to get full arch added on top of it. Because if you try to add full arch on top of it, it's going to fully break everything. And we've actually seen that. Now, the second thing, so you have systems. And then the second thing is emotions, which I thought was interesting when you brought that up as we were prepping for this. If you're not emotionally ready for full arch, you're not going to do well. And if your team's not emotionally ready for full arch, you're not going to do well. What do you mean by that?
So besides systems and processes, having your team emotionally prepared, I think, is probably single-handedly the most important part of developing full arch. And the reason being is because we're changing lives, right? Like I said before, this isn't your typical bread and butter dentistry. We're not just looking at preventative hygiene, right? That's something that's on a 6-month routine. You usually start to develop that when you're a child, and we roll through it throughout life, right? But when it comes to full arch, we have patients that are looking for care that have been in this situation for years. Maybe there was neglect. Maybe they neglected their teeth for years. Maybe there's, finally they're in a good place where either financially they're in a good place or they have a big event coming up and they're really excited about it. And so both of those, no matter the situation, is an emotional decision, right? And so we talk about emotional buying cycles during full arch because it really is. It's not just, hey, I've been prepared my whole life. I've been prepped my whole life to go to the dentist every 6 months and to get it checked out. This is, I have a problem. I've had it for a really, really long time. And I kind of need you to hold my hand along the way to help me get out of this situation. We find that with full arch patients, they're scared. They're scared financially. This is going to be, this is going to cost just as much as a car. This is emotional, in their day-to-day lives. We're not just looking at cosmetic, or we're not just looking at, a filling or a crown, a little bit of restorative work. We're talking about big life-changing decisions. And one of the biggest points that we try to make when we're talking about full arch, when I go into practices and they say, hey, I'm ready to add full arch, we talk about what they're selling. What exactly are you selling? And what I hear is beautiful smile. And it's like, that's fantastic, right? Everybody wants a beautiful smile, but it's so much deeper than that. And that's where that emotional connection comes in. And we have to make sure that the team is prepared for that. When they do call or they submit a form that says, hey, I'm interested, or a survey that I'm interested, we have to take the time to spend with them to get to know, what was your decision behind calling now, right? Maybe we know this has been happening for years, but why now? How long have you been thinking about something like this? Have you gone to other places to have this evaluated? Have you been diagnosed with anything? And so just even on the phone, we spend about 3 to 5 times longer on that first lead call than we do with your typical GP lead. We walk,
and that's true, and that's true all the way through. It's you're just using the lead call, but it's also the same when the patient shows up to the appointment. It's not just like, hey, just wait here, you're going to get your cleaning, because, and I'll just throw this in, when everybody already knows what to expect when you get your teeth cleaned, because everybody's already had their teeth cleaned. So there's already a level of expectation, which removes fear, right? But if you are coming in for a major surgery and you're just treating them like a hygiene patient, you're going to have a problem. Like, there's going to be a major disconnect.
Yes. Yeah. Full arch is a completely different mindset. We talk about shifting your mindset because it is 10 times more complex than GP, not only from, making sure that you're operational ready, but also that you're emotionally connected and that your team is emotionally connected to these patients as well. And like you had said, it walks all the way through that patient journey, from that lead call to the assistant that takes them back, to the doctor that does the evaluation, and then all the way to the treatment coordinator that's going to help close that case. There is an emotional connection along the entire journey. And one of the biggest things that we talk about in full arch is, like I had said before, what are you selling? And it's not just a beautiful smile. We're talking about somebody's comfort every day, every second of every day for the rest of their life, right? And so, it like you had said, it's not just your average hygiene patient coming in to get their teeth cleaned. We're talking about comfort. We're talking about health. We're talking about confidence. So,
yep.
Yeah.
Everybody has to be ready for that. Everybody has to be ready for that. Not just the doctor, not just the treatment coordinator, not just the front desk, the whole team all the way through. So if you don't have that, if you haven't had that level set and have prepared your team for this, then it's going to be different. And here's the other thing that I'll add. Just because you're doing full arch already doesn't mean you're ready for this, because what I've seen a lot of offices do is they'll do 1 or 2 arches of patients they've worked with forever. Right. Yep. So they've known this Betty, who's been coming to their office for the last 20 years. And finally, she's just like, you know what, I really need to get this solved. And the doctor says, okay, we're going to do this treatment. Well, the whole team already knows her. She already knows your team. So that emotional side is removed from it. Right. But a brand new patient walking into your office you've never met before, or calling your office that you never met before, that's definitely not the case. And it isn't the same. It's totally radically different. So that's actually the first time I've ever heard anybody bring this up. So I think that's really, really important. So here's how we know when we're ready to start full arch is when our systems are all squared away. We talked about that. Your team's emotionally ready. And I think this one is probably, it's one of the easiest to talk about, but probably one of the harder to fill, is having the right people. Yeah. And you can either train your people you have now, or you can find the right people who are already doing this and bringing them in. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, it's super important to make sure that you have the right people in the right seat, because this is connecting those systems to the emotional perspective and tying all of that into your people. So you have to have people that are process driven. You have to have people that are emotionally connected. And you can't train that, right? You can't train emotions. People have to come with that. But you can train the skill level. And so when we talk about people, first and foremost, you have to have a skilled trained clinician, right? Somebody that's had the didactic training, has placed, some implants, has had those courses. But next, you have to have a dedicated team when it comes to full arch. So you have to have somebody that is ready, has the capacity and the time to nurture the leads that are coming through. So we have to remember that when you are looking to add full arch, it takes hundreds of leads every single month to come through your practice to get a couple of starts, right? And that sounds crazy to a lot of dentists probably that are like, I'm spending a lot of money on full arch. What do you mean I'm only going to get a couple of starts? And the reason is because we talked about it being a long emotional buying cycle, right? And so people are ready, but are they ready? And are they ready now? They might be ready here in the future. We might have to preheat them for quite some time to get them to trust you and to fulfill that treatment. But we have to have somebody that is dedicated on the phones, has that time and capacity to handle the influx of leads that you're going to have come through and really nurture them. So that is one of the most important, besides the actual dentist. Having that lead nurture is super, super important. They have to have compassion and they have to be trained to handle those calls. With that, what I've seen in practices is...
Let me just add this in real quick before you move forward. You can't just take a GP person who's been answering the phones and throw them into full arch. It won't work, period.
Yeah, 100%. And that's where you have to have that emotional connection. You have to have them trained to have that time and capacity to be able to spend on those leads. Where we've seen a lot of practices struggle is getting them to show up, right? So we have to have that process in place. I know we talked about systems before, but that's another one, is making sure that we have a confirmation process to get them to come up, to show up. The other one that, it's really hard to determine or to decide which one's most important, the dentist, the lead nurturer, the assistant, the treatment coordinator. But the treatment coordinator is so, so important when you're deciding who's going to be the one to present this $25,000, $50,000 case. You have to have a treatment coordinator that has some type of sales training, right? And again, it can't just be the person at the front desk that is trained to talk about hygiene. This is somebody that has to have that emotional connection, be able to break down those barriers and be okay with a no, right? Because what I've seen, even myself included, when I worked in a practice and I was just at the front desk and they said, okay, Kristen, I want you to present this case. And I was thrown in it. And it was a $50,000 treatment plan. And I about lost it. I swallowed and I said, okay, we're going to do this. And I learned so much just in that first time presenting a $50,000 treatment plan. I had no idea what I was doing.
What was your biggest treatment plan before that you presented?
Oh, maybe 2,000, 2,500, like a crown.
That's such a big jump.
Yes. And I had no idea. Of course, they never came back, right? Because I wasn't trained to walk them through these different barriers that we need to break down. And so that's why it's so important to have the right person in that seat. And I know that sales, dentists always say like, oh, we don't talk about sales in dentistry. It's not sales. It's treatment. They need this. And you're absolutely right. Just like we need a car to get around, but there's somebody that's going to sell us that car to get us around. Right. Yep. So I know that the S word is very frowned upon in dental, but it's super, super important that we have that person that has some sales training in full arch to be able to close these cases. So it gets more and more complex as you go on, right? So first we have to have enough leads to come through your door. You have to have the right process.
And that's the call scheduler. So so if you need more leads, look at the call scheduler.
Yep. And then we have to have them on your schedule, right? Then we have to jump the hurdle of getting them to show up. And then we have to present the treatment. And then we have to get them to close. And even after you close, you still have to get them to show up for the actual treatment and to be able to pay for it, right? So
and then you have to have the clinician who's going to make sure that this isn't going to fail? Because if you have I've had so many podcasts that I've done with people where they're like, yeah, the first several people I've worked with, they failed and I had to redo those. And that's more work that you don't get paid for usually, that now you have this whole new system of people coming back that you probably haven't had to deal with, maybe a little bit with crowns or, filling popping out here or there, but nothing to this scale where it's going to take half of your day to go solve this now and explain this to the patient.
But you have to know that's going to come, right? That's going to happen. Yeah.
Yep. Yeah.
And you're going to spend a lot of money to get them to come through the door, and you're going to have a couple of cases come out of it, right? So yeah, there's a lot of unknown, but you have to be ready for that. Like we like to say, you have to be comfortable with the uncomfortable. And the uncomfortable is getting a no and having a case fail. But that's okay.
And the sad thing about dental is like, there's so many people who will encourage people to jump into full arch because it's advantageous for them for marketing budget or equipment or, or buying the next thing or the next course. But in reality, if you don't have these things ready to go, you really shouldn't be starting full arch. Yeah. So Kristen, as always, thank you so much for coming on. You did a great job today, and I appreciate you just sharing your knowledge with the world.
Absolutely. Thank you, Gary.